Today, I'll be going over 7 essential tips that will help you ace your approach and improve your landings in the Cessna 172. The landing phase of flight training is probably the most challenging, mainly because it's really daunting getting that aircraft back on the ground. But landings are mandatory. Every single landing is different due to weather conditions, obstructions at the end of the runway, runway length, and even runway conditions. And on top of that, the airplane can be configured for landing in several different ways. Full flaps, partial flaps, no flaps. If you're like me, got a tail dragger with no flaps. My Luscombe 80 doesn't have any flaps. Now I'm side slipping using the fuselage as one big flap to help me slow down and get down to land. So let's make sure you watch to the end because you don't want to miss tip number 7. And I got a lot of good information for you today. We talk about making good landings. We have got to definitely talk about the approach to land because it all starts at the approach. Every good landing has a good approach. While you're in the approach phase, make sure you are using the recommended checklist by the aircraft manufacturer. Make sure you're making the proper radio calls, whether you're at a non-towered airport or a towered airport. And that brings us to tip number 1, the downwind. While you're on the downwind, make sure the before landing checklist is completed and make sure you clear the air of any traffic. So make sure you got your head on a swivel. You're looking to the left, you're looking to your right, you're looking out in front of you, you're looking up above you as best you can, you're looking down below as best you can. I've been in the traffic pattern plenty of times at a non-towered airport. There's somebody out there flying a J3 Cub and they are just cutting everybody off in the traffic pattern. This stuff does happen. For every one landing everybody got, this guy got like 3. Conflicts in the traffic pattern, they do happen. So make sure clear the air and keep your head on a swivel. As you approach the beam point of where you want to touch down, you want to make sure that you are at traffic pattern altitude and you're at that cruising airspeed. At your 180-degree point, you want to establish a power setting that's going to allow you to descend. At the same time that you establish this descent power setting, you're going to want to maintain your altitude just so you can slow the airplane down to the correct approach speed. And once you've reached this recommended approach speed, now you can begin your descent. Tip number 2, make sure you're checking for traffic. Make sure you're checking for traffic that might be on the base leg, traffic that might be on the final leg, right? Because you may have to extend your downwind for traffic spacing. What I like to do, if there's any traffic on final approach, I like to wait until that traffic has passed off my wingtip. So if I'm flying a left traffic pattern, I'm going to wait until that traffic that's on final passes by my left wingtip before I even think about making a base turn. However, if you are the only person in the traffic pattern at the time, once you descended about 100 to 200 feet, then we can start making our turn to base. By this time, when you start making that turn to base, you've descended 100 to 200 feet. By that time, your landing point should be about 45 degrees off your left shoulder, behind the wing. Tip number 3, the base leg. Now you're on your base leg. Now you're at a crucial point in the flight, a crucial point in the pattern where you have to assess what's going on and where you are in the pattern. You're going to have to make critical assessment of your situation. At this point in the traffic pattern, you're going to have to make judicious decisions with your airspeed, altitude, and your distance from the runway to ensure that you're going to grease this landing upon touchdown. At this phase of the flight, you definitely do not want to make big abrupt changes to anything that you're doing. This is not the stage of the flight that you want to do that. You just want to keep it nice and stable the rest of the way. Tip number 4, the final approach. You're at the phase of the traffic pattern where you're looking at final and you're making sure that there's nobody cutting you off, there's nobody landing, there's no J3 Cubs out there not using radios and just cutting you off in the traffic pattern. You're going to make sure your final is clear and then you're going to begin your turn to final. Now that you're on final approach, you should be roughly 3 to 500 feet above the ground level and roughly a quarter mile away from the runway threshold. While you're on final approach, as far as airspeed goes, you want to use what the manufacturer recommends. Another good rule of thumb to use is 1.3 times VSO, which is the power off stall speed. Make sure you're using those outside visual references to determine if you're on the proper descent angle and on the proper glide path. And a couple good visual indicators would be the use of the VASI and the poppies. While you're making a constant descent angle, the runway will appear to be unchanged. For instance, if you're making too low of an approach, the runway will appear flat. it'll appear wide and shorter. If you're approaching too high, the runway will appear narrower and longer, and you're gonna have a steeper angle of approach going to the runway. And if you're making a good descent angle to the runway, the sides of the runway will remain the same. The runway threshold will remain in a somewhat of a fixed position with relation to the nose of the aircraft. Also, make sure you're making the necessary pitch adjustments and power adjustments to maintain your airspeed and the proper descent angle. Now this brings us to the landing. During the landing, you're going to be using a series of visual cues and muscle memories that come from flying certain maneuvers. Maneuvers that you are probably very familiar with. Maneuvers such as slow flight, practicing those descents, power off stalls, and flying the aircraft in ground effect. I feel like we don't talk about the traffic pattern or the approach to landing as being a flight maneuver. For the most part, it is just something that we just execute ABC 1, 2, 3. We are on downwind, we're on base, we're on final. Now we're in the flare, we touch down, and now we're taxiing off the runway and taxiing to the FBO and shutting down. Not enough is being said to how certain flight maneuvers relate to a good landing. And if you work really hard at these flight maneuvers and you take certain elements that you're executing out in the practice area, you bring them back here and you take those certain elements, they will make for some of the best butter landings you've ever made. For instance, slow flight. So your ability to be able to slow the airplane down, slowing it down and flying it at a very slow airspeed is going to give you a really good sense of the controls, a really good sense of how to maneuver the aircraft when it's at a slower airspeed, and thereby you're going to be able to make that slow approach to landing and touchdown. And when you're in that ground effect phase, it's going to make for better landing, a better touchdown. Tip number 5, the flare. There are 3 phases to the landing. It's the flare, the touchdown, and the rollout. The flare is all about changing from a descent angle to a landing attitude. When you go from the descent angle to the flare, you're gonna be roughly 10 to 20 feet above the surface of the runway. Allow for some wiggle room here. Some people who flare at 5 feet, some who flare at 10, some who flare at 15. I think that sweet spot is anywhere between that 5 and 15 feet. In this flare, you're going to want to use ground effect to your advantage. You're going to constantly be increasing that back pressure. You know, you're going to let the airplane settle to the ground by itself. We don't want to force it. Add some of that back pressure while you're holding it off. You've probably heard your flight instructor say, stall it onto the runway. While you're holding it off, you're looking down the runway. Don't need to be looking anywhere else. Don't need to focus anywhere else. Focus down the runway. Tip number 6, the touchdown. When we touch down, we want to touch down on the main gear at nose high attitude with the engine idle. Make sure we're keeping it going straight down the runway with the use of the rudder, and continue to hold that back pressure and let the nose settle down on its own. As the nose starts to come down, gradually release that back pressure as the nose gear settles to the runway gently. And tip number 7, the rollout. On the rollout, make sure we are maintaining the center line of the runway by using the rudder, and then clear the runway, perform your after landing checklist, taxi to your designated FBO. Remember, making good landings takes a lot of practice, takes time. Don't beat yourself up because you've gone out and you've had a few bad landings. It happens. It takes time. Following these 7 tips will definitely improve your landings 100%. So go ahead, click on this video right here for more aviation insights.